If we could start perhaps by you saying who you are, and then I think you've got a statement.
My name's Fensome, and we're here to talk about Primodos.
My name is Lyon. I'm the chair of the Association for Children Damaged by Hormone Pregnancy Tests.
He just took these tablets out of his drawer and he said, take these.
In terms of birth defects, obviously, I have no hands. I only have 4 toes on each foot.
They whisked her away from me, put her in an incubator. She died 4 days later.
They seem to be in denial of what is blindingly obvious to any observer who is listening and watching.
It's a life sentence. The effect of this drug is multi-generational. It just goes on and on and on.
Humans aren't guinea pigs. They're not lab rats. The fact that he did this study for 5 years is in itself damning enough.
It takes a huge toll on people to carry on campaigning when every time you raise your voice, you seem to be knocking your head against a brick wall.
It was worth it just to face them. Let them see face to face who it is that's actually coming after them.
Okay.
It hadn't known me. I'm on my own. I've never met anybody. Never married, had children. It's almost as though I'm not there. If I'm with someone else, they won't look at me and talk to me, they talk to another person. With me.
You must want to scream at people.
Oh, yeah.
You feel like you're talking to yourself because they just didn't bother to, they're not bothered to listen.
No.
Right. So Nicky was one of the first people I met when I started investigating this drug. But I met numerous people with all sorts of different malformations, some of them visible, some of them heart defects or brain damage. And the manufacturer always denied that Primodos caused any of these malformations. But I think that this is one of the biggest scandals in the pharmaceutical industry, and it's been covered up.
Obviously, the major issue that I have, my right arm only goes down to as far as the wrist would be, and my left arm, I have an elbow, and that's it. I've also only got 4 toes on each foot. One foot is considerably larger than the other foot. I've had a lot of dental procedures because my jaws don't fit together properly, and my teeth are still rather higgledy-piggledy. I've had eye surgery as well. I see predominantly out of one eye.
Probably my earliest memory of noticing that everybody didn't have a brother like Stephen was probably when I was in primary school. A couple of friends were going to come home for dinner, and I seem to remember them screaming and crying in the car because they were frightened of him. But they were only children who'd never been around anybody with this kind of disability before. But I do seem to remember thinking to myself, well, what's the matter with them? That's their problem.
There we go, we're going to see Mum and Dad. Because I promised you, didn't I?
Not yet, because it's gone a little bit lower. Stephen's 52 years old. He's my older brother. He has uncontrollable epilepsy with learning difficulties, so he's 24-hour care. He has to be fed, washed, dressed. He doesn't sleep at night. He has seizures every day.
Hi, Shell.
My parents have always been really keen to give him as normal a life as possible.
Come on, sunshine.
He's flown on planes, he's driven through Europe in the car.
You had a surprise today, Shell. I'll come to fetch you then, eh?
He even came skiing with us once.
Yeah, that's good.
There's nothing more powerful than a fight for justice when you've experienced so much suffering. You know, there are families that have suffered their whole life, a lot of them, and that does give you some fight. And we have the truth on our side, and I have to trust that that will come out, because they can't hide from it forever. Lyon is the campaign. I've never known anybody so determined, so tenacious. There really is no stopping her.
We have been campaigning since 1978. Those tablets were given to pregnant women and they contained 40 times the amount of an oral contraceptive. We have been fighting for Bayer to admit their culpability, and we continue today.
Thank you very much, Mary, for your contribution.
They feel they are such a huge corporation that nobody can touch them. And it was important to let them know that nobody's too huge. If there's an injustice, somehow or other, justice will be served. Might take us 50-odd years, but we'll get there in the end. And really, the message was, we are not going away. We are not going away.
Hormone pregnancy tests came on the market in 1958 in Europe, and they were manufactured from synthetic sex hormones, like the contraceptive pill, but stronger. The market leader was Shearing, and they sold it under different brand names. So, for example, in Germany, it was called Deugenon, and in the UK, it was called Primodos.
In the 1960s, the toad test is still the dominant test for pregnancy. A lab technician would inject the toad with urine, come back the next morning, see if there were eggs at the bottom of the jar, and if there were, that was a positive test result. Primodos is initially a treatment for amenorrhea, delayed menstruation, and secondarily becomes used as a test for pregnancy. These marketing campaigns really aggressively target the toad test as more expensive, slower, not as sensitive, so you have to wait a couple of weeks after the first missed period before you can do it. So there's all these advantages that the Primodos test has, allegedly, over the toad test. A woman will go to her GPs, she'll say, I think I'm pregnant. The GP will say, here, take these 2 tablets. If you bleed, then you're not pregnant. If nothing happens, then you are pregnant.
That time period, 4 to 8 weeks, is when the embryo is forming. It's when the brain is forming, the nervous system, the arms, the legs, the internal organs. After the 8th week, the embryo is fully formed and it just grows. But those first 8 weeks is where it's all happening. So you're taking a man-made synthetic sex hormones, high doses of it. Would I be surprised if it caused problems? As an embryologist, no, I wouldn't.
All right, so you might either 41, take 1 and back. All right, off you go.
41, take 1.
That's my boy. He was a good-looking baby. His feet were very blue, and when he was born, and the nurse said, oh, he's probably cold or something. I hadn't been a father before, but I immediately became concerned that I felt that there was something just wasn't clicking right with this child.
Shall we give it to Yvonne?
In the end, I said, look, I'm not happy about this. We need to get somebody to look at him. He was put under the care of another senior consultant paediatrician, and then came the bombshell. Those words, "I'm afraid this is serious." I said, "Well, you know, what's the problem?" He said, "Well, he has a condition called tricuspid atresia, which means that part of his heart and one of his valves are not there." First of all, I perhaps should say that when Alison became pregnant, she went to her GP. He took these 2 tablets out of the drawer and said, "Well, we don't have to do a urine test. It's easy these days. You just take these 2 pills. Take one tonight, one tomorrow night." I remember questioning this at the time. I said, why is he giving you drugs to test for pregnancy? And she said, "Well, you know, the doctor says it's fine and this is the new way and this is progress and, you know."
He kept thinking that I was pregnant and kept going round to the doctors. He said, "Are you trying for a baby?" So that's when he gave me the 2 tablets and said, "You take one when you get home, another one in the morning, and then come back and see me, and then we'll go from there."
I was actually delighted because I had assumed it would be an examination or a urine test, and the fact now that this new way of finding out you were pregnant was out, I just thought it was brilliant.
When Primodos comes on the market, very few people ask any questions about it. The patient trusts the doctor seems to trust the manufacturer, and the UK regulator doesn't seem to have much oversight, which is surprising, considering this is all occurring around the time of the biggest pharmaceutical scandal in history, which also affects babies in the womb.
Kevin Donnellan is 11 years old and lives with his family in a suburb of Liverpool. In the first few weeks of her pregnancy, his mother Agnes Donnellan took 5 sleeping tablets. The tablets were called Distaval. They contained the drug thalidomide.
I think what most people don't realise, that thalidomide is the worst peacetime disaster in terms of death and damage to people since the Second World War. It's quite amazing that so many mistakes have been made since the thalidomide disaster happened. The lessons weren't really learnt.
When my waters broke first, I was obviously in labour, and as soon as Nicky head came through, that's all I remember.
She was late, you know, she was overdue, so it was decided to induce, which they did. And when she was born, I remember the first thing, because they took her away very, very quickly.
I came to at one time, and there was a priest at the end of the bed, and to be honest, I thought I had died and I was in heaven. And what they wanted was the name, what we wanted to call her, because they were going to baptise her, because obviously they didn't think she was going to survive.
I did kind of think, oh gosh, they're taking a long time. The nurse came in and they were holding Sarah, but they wrapped her quite tightly. And she just said, "Look, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to tell you that your baby was born without the lower part of her arm being formed."
I don't think anybody actually said she had gone, but that's what I was led to believe. Every time I sort of came to, I kept coming to and going off again. And he said, "No, she's alive and she's got birthmarks."
And she handed her to me, and as I'd started to kind of she just said, "Oh," and I just said, "I want to look at her properly," and I just undid all the wrapping. And what it was just like a tiny little, like a bud, if you like, with these 5 tiny little digits at the end of her elbow. And obviously where the hand and the arm hadn't developed was just encased in this little piece.
I don't think they really knew how to handle everything.
Because you don't think of the long-term implications All I was concerned about was she was healthy, she was safe, she was gorgeous.
She was mine and I loved her and that was it. So she was special. You know, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The first real alarm bell is sounded in 1967, and it comes from a bit of an outsider, a remarkable woman, a paediatrician called Dr. Isabel Gall.
My mother was born in a small town in the southern part of Hungary. My mother, both her sisters and her mother, were taken to Auschwitz, and they were all survivors of that. Absolutely extraordinary that they survived, but they did. It was because my aunt was already here, married to an Englishman, that they came to England as opposed to Australia or Canada, which I think were the other main places for these refugees to go. She was working in Carshalton, Queen Mary's Hospital, with women who had had malformed babies. She was looking at the possible causes.
The really crucial turning point in the history of Primodos is this paper published by Isabel Gall in the prestigious science journal Nature. And she notices that a few of the mothers have taken Primodos or Amidorone Forte during pregnancy.
She was incredibly perceptive about people's symptoms. Time and again, when she interviewed the mothers of malformed babies, the same sort of things kept coming up again. Looking at the hormone pregnancy test was an accidental discovery as a result of her being very perceptive and making links in the interviews that she had with these mothers about their medical history.
At the same time, she writes a letter to William Inman, who's head of the Committee for Safety on Drugs at the time.
One of the key figures in the early days of regulating new drugs in the United Kingdom was Professor Bill Inman.
Bill was a delightful man. He had suffered polio as a child. Despite that, went to medical school and graduated as a doctor.
My choice of career was really dictated by the fact that I had polio as a medical student.
Yes. But of course, being wheelchair-bound made it impossible for him to carry on the kinds of jobs that doctors would be expected to do. So he chose to do what was, in effect, a desk job, if you like. And he joined the regulatory authority.
So once Isabel Gall publishes her research in Nature in 1967, she's worried about it, and she contacts the regulator, Professor William Inman. He's kind of receptive at first. But then, you know, you look at the correspondence, and I notice on the heads of paper, it's always men involved in this, and there is this kind of paternalistic, patronising tone to the correspondence, I think. And there's this almost suggestion that this young woman couldn't possibly have spotted something significant that everyone else had missed.
It's clear that Inman was having difficulty coming to terms with Isabel Gall's forceful representation of the data and was himself rather reluctant to damn a drug without what he considered to be strong evidence.
So even though he's dismissive of Isabel Gall's findings, he does decide to set up his own study. And that involves going to the National Register, finding babies that have been born with malformations, going to their doctors, finding out what drugs their mothers have taken, and then having a control group as well. And he says in the correspondence, this is going to take some considerable time. And you have to ask yourself at that point the ethics of keeping this drug on the market while you're effectively testing to see whether women who take the drug have malformed babies. They're being used as guinea pigs. In 1975, Professor Inman finally publishes the interim results of his study in the British Medical Journal. And it shows that fetal abnormalities have been recorded among those women using hormonal pregnancy tests, such as Primodos. And it concludes there is little justification for their continued use. Now, the Committee on Safety of Medicines issues a leaflet saying that it is possible that the use of these preparations could lead to abnormalities in the fetus. Enough to warrant a label being attached to the box
Warning, Primodos must not be taken unless it's certain that the patient is not pregnant.
That was such a shock because they had declared from day one that there was absolutely no link whatsoever with any kind of adverse effect and taking the hormone pregnancy tests.
And then in 1977, a decade after Dr. Gal first made contact with him, Inman publishes the full outcome of his research. And that leads to a warning being sent to doctors that an association has been confirmed between the drug and malformations in babies. You'd think, wouldn't you, at this point, some people might hold their hands up and say, we've made a big mistake. But that doesn't happen. It's up to the families to start investigating, to find out what's been going on behind closed doors.
We had no internet, we had no email. Everything was done at a much slower pace, so that there was only one way to contact people, and that was through the mail or by telephone. But it all came very quickly, and an awful lot of people came forward.
Susan Stern collects her daughter Vanessa from Cranage Hospital near Knutsford in Cheshire. For the past 3 years, the hospital has been Vanessa's home.
Nobody knows what the doctor's giving them. You take tablets because the doctor says you should take them.
And do you know the brand name of the tablets that you actually took?
Yes,
What is it?
Primodos.
There are still large numbers of doctors, relatively speaking, prescribing drugs which are actually dangerous and for which there is no justification at all.
Most of the children that we have on our books at the moment are affected with heart conditions, invariably very serious, massive malformations of the heart, hair, lip and cleft palate, limb reduction in much the same way that thalidomide children were affected.
The MP, Jack Ashley, has 4 times asked for a public inquiry and 4 times been turned down. He now plans to take the issue further.
Today I should be approaching the Ombudsman and asking him to find out why there was this excessive delay of 8 years before any official warnings were issued by the government or by the CSM.
We have a watchdog committee in this country, the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, and it is their job to satisfy the public that drugs coming onto the market are safe. I can assure you that we will pursue this all the way.
So in 1978, there's been all this adverse publicity and the regulators saying the association is confirmed. The manufacturer Shearing decides they're going to pull it from the market for what they say are commercial reasons. But behind the scenes within the company, it's clear that there has been a lot of disquiet and concern about this drug.
I was invited to go to Germany by a group of people working within the German health service. I'd no sooner arrived in my hotel, I get a telephone call. And this guy said, I'm not going to give you my name, he said, but I work for Shearing's and I'd like to meet you. I want to tell you something. He said, I'm a doctor and I work in the laboratories. I just want you to know I absolutely support what you are doing because I know from my work that this drug does terrible things to rats. I said, why all this cloak and dagger stuff? He said, well, if they find out I've spoken to you, he said, we have a court in the company. And he said, I will be tried, I will be out, and I will never get another job.
In the 1970s, I was a private detective operating an agency in Brighton. I received a phone call from a solicitor. He invited me to go up to his office to meet a senior executive with a pharmaceutical company called Schering. He was based in their UK office, and his primary responsibility was the sale and marketing of various pharmaceutical products, but including the drug known as Primodos. He said to me the drug itself potentially had a risk of damaging the unborn fetus, and he felt he had to leak it.
I knew there were a set of documents around which were supposed to be quite damning.
Good evening. Tonight, we're going to examine a vitally important issue.
We discovered that they were in the hands of a private detective in Brighton.
It concerns the way we make sure that drugs and medicines in regular use are safe.
So we invited him up for lunch and sat and talked to him about the whole story and asked him, would he give us the papers?
In a report prepared by Greg Dyke, we're going to look in detail at the history of these drugs.
To our surprise, he gave them to us and didn't want anything for them.
We're going to explain how they worked, why they were introduced, and what happened in the years after it was first suggested that they might be damaging to the unborn child.
This is a letter from Schering Chemicals in Sussex to the headquarters in Germany in '68, and it says, ethically speaking, we are not satisfied that sufficient has been done to remove the suspicion which has been cast upon Primodos to sufficient degree for us to be confident in supporting its continued availability. Now that, if you take away the rather flowery words, what that basically says is, we're not sure this drug has been properly tested.
So you think about it, there's a warning on the packet saying don't take it if you're pregnant. There's the regulator saying the association has been confirmed. The drug company's taken it off the market. The family think they've got a pretty good case. So they decide to sue the company.
Schering had a meeting which was held at Leeds Castle to make a decision about how they were going to deal with this. Were they going to settle or were they going to fight it? They made the decision that they would fight it. We had two things to prove. One is negligence and one is causation. We didn't think there would be any problem with proving negligence. However, the big issue was, did the drug cause these injuries or didn't? That's causation. That is hugely difficult to prove. You have to rely totally on historical information, evidence, and the opinion of expert witnesses.
They are relying on the industry to have done the research. They might have got a few people to do some studies, and they're lucky. They've got Isabel Gal, this conscientious woman who's come up with a study and spotted a problem. But the only people, other than her, who seem to have followed it up is the regulator. And they don't seem too keen to help the families because they're the ones that left it on the market for 8 years.
Because we were legal aided, we had limited resources.
We had about 10 or 11 experts who were willing to give evidence that they had personally completed studies that actually proved the link.
We felt that we had a good case.
Two of those suddenly decided that they couldn't appear.
One by one, these expert witnesses who were going to speak on our behalf suddenly turned around and said, I'm sorry, but I'll have to withdraw, you know. I've been offered a research grant which would cause a conflict of interest.
We ended up, I think, with something like 7 or 8, and Schering's had 31 experts. We were outnumbered, outgunned, absolutely. We didn't have the finances, and we just had to disband.
Judge Bingham, who's presiding over this case in the Royal Courts of Justice, says, look, there's not enough evidence. We're going to have to put this case on pause. But there is a concession.
I do give the plaintiffs the right to come back to court should new evidence which supports their case come to light.
At the time, I just felt that we've nowhere else to go, and there were two options. You could either become quite bitter, or you could get on with your life, and I decided just to get on with life.
What one of his teachers at the special school, he said to me one day, Sean's getting worse, isn't he? I mean, by this stage, I mean, Sean was 10 years old, but I had to carry him to the car. He couldn't walk to the car, to carry him to the car. And then he suddenly said, I can't see. And then he collapsed backwards. The terrible thing that his younger sister was sitting next to him, and I had to say to her, you know, hold Sean, don't let him fall over, you know. Nobody who's not lost a child can understand. They can be sympathetic and say how absolutely dreadful, but they do not know. They have no way of knowing how awful, how absolutely awful it is. And you have to really will yourself to keep going because it's just sort of absolute devastation, you know.
After the court case collapses in 1982, nothing happens. It goes quiet. Nobody talks about Primodos for 30 years. But one significant thing happens over that time period. The children who survived grow up. And they start asking questions. Yeah. Okay, just say your full name for me, Carl.
Yeah, it's Carl Murphy.
Just tell me about growing up. What was it like?
I was born with, obviously, fingers missing on my right hand, small digits on my left. I also have a cleft palate and a hair lip. I've got no toes on my left foot. It was hard.
When did you start to think that it might be Primodos that caused your problems?
I got a computer in 2007 and I started putting it in. I contacted my mum at the time and she said there was information in the attic. I found documents that had shearings, headed paper.
SkyNews has obtained documents which suggest that a drug once used as a pregnancy test may have caused deformities in babies.
I contacted SkyNews. I told them the story.
In the 1970s and 80s, parents tried to prove that the drug Primodos affected the development of their babies in the womb.
They give me Jason Farrell's email address and telephone number. 30
years on, the children allegedly affected by the drug are attempting to rekindle their parents' legal challenge.
And he turned up and I brought all the stuff, all the information I had, and we went through it.
Carl has now made an extraordinary discovery that may reignite the case.
Right, so this is a German magazine, and that's you.
That's me, yeah.
The German journalists who wrote this article gave Carl's mum confidential papers that they'd obtained from shearing. After sitting unread in her loft for 30 years, copies of these documents are now with lawyers in London and form the backbone for a potential new legal challenge. Well, I'm sifting through all these documents and I can see there's internal correspondence from the company. There's the Isabel Gall study, but there's another study that they're referring to by the Royal College of GPs, and that seems to have found a higher instance of malformations, stillbirths, infant deaths, and miscarriages by women who took this drug. And the report author says the drug should be removed from the market. So I'm thinking this is a big story inside this suitcase. There's a huge story here. And I can see that Carl's looking at the same documents, and for him, this is a smoking gun. This might explain why he is the way he is. So he decides he's got the case for legal action.
I contacted the drug manufacturer. They just swapped from shearing to Bayer. They said they did not hold any information regarding Primodos. I got the association up and running. We had a lawyer. I had to go down to London to the legal aid departments to meet them and present it in front of the panel.
and then we had to wait. Hello? Excellent, thank you so much, thank you. Thank you, Peter. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye. It's all official. To be told on the steps of Lime Street Station with Jason, you've been granted the legal aid of £25,000 was like amazing. We're one further step forward here. I did, don't get me wrong, I stalked them. I stalked, but yeah. You like your coffee? They would get emails off me day, night, morning. I really did. I was asking for freedom of information requests constantly. Beyer used to hold a 10k run down in Newbury. So I entered myself, and other people entered as well. I'd also took documents down there, which I had told Sky News I was going to present to the PR of Beyer.
Thank you very much.
Here's the victims with us.
Yep.
Okay.
Can't. I'll do this afterwards, thanks. We're kind of busy.
I just want to give you that. This is the, well,
Can't.
I'd like to give you the file from all the Primodos victims of your food.
You know,
we want to give you this.
That's fine. We can do this afterwards, or with the lawyers. You've been told that we're going to meet you through the lawyers.
So you don't want it?
The lawyers.
So you don't want it?
I don't want it. The lawyers.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. There we go.
What happened there, Carl? What happened there?
He's refused to take the file off us and said we'll do it through the lawyers. So that's the way they want it. Fine.
Carl decides to use his legal aid money to invest in research at Newcastle University to look at the available scientific evidence and see if it can show a causal association between the drug and birth defects. And we know from the case back in 1982 that there isn't much available evidence. So sure enough, it comes back and it shows that this association can't be shown. And for Carl, who's pumped his heart and soul into this campaign, this is a huge blow.
I thought, here we go, 2 steps back now. You know, how can we, you know, where's this going to go? How do we carry on? I walked away. I walked away because I had to think of my own mental health. I could feel myself just ready to, my head to just explode. And I had to just say, enough's enough.
I actually became chair in 2012.
Filming you?
Thank you very much. Just because I never did that. There's so much that people are not aware of. There are so many things that are hidden that need to be exposed. We're not the people who are being looked after. We're the people that are being tolerated. That's the frightening thing for me, that we're not actually human beings, we're statistics. And that's really what spurs me on, because I see the human side of this every time I meet with our members. Some have never had children because they couldn't bear to go through the same kind of experience. Some are still changing nappies for, you know, children in the 50s. It's made me stronger in that I don't accept anymore that we can't do something about it. We can do something about it. So welcome everybody. I know that today we will have new members.
This woman from Wigan brings tremendous
energy to the campaign. She's also quite savvy, so she gets the families to write to their local MPs with their stories, and they have a huge impact.
The work that she did, getting the MPs involved, getting the constituents writing to their MPs, she is just absolutely phenomenal. She brought knowledge, she brought dedication, she brought expertise, she brought sympathy, and she's such a good human being. And she did it all on a voluntary basis.
And finally, in 2016, she is successful in pressuring the government in setting up an expert working group that will look into Primodos. And they're in the terms of reference asking if there is a possible association between the drug and birth defects. This group is overseen by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulator, the MHRA, which is the modern-day equivalent of the body that Professor William Inman ran.
I was delighted, absolutely delighted. This was supposed to be an independent group of scientists who would look at all the evidence, every single piece of evidence.
I was invited as an expert to make sure that this was a more balanced inquiry and a more open inquiry and a fairer inquiry than perhaps would have happened in the past.
When it was announced that there was going to be an expert working group looking into the question of whether or not the hormone pregnancy tests had caused fetal malformations, I was very surprised. I thought, surely we know this. This was demonstrated years ago.
While Mari's been busy with the association, lobbying Parliament, I've been going through these documents that Carl had in his attic. Hi, Alex. Yeah, good, thanks. And there's a lot to go at. They've told me it's happening, yeah. Speak soon. Bye. I realised I needed a bit of help, so I drafted in a producer called Liz Lane. Were you interested in India?
We have to gather as much evidence as possible from lots of different sources. There are studies from around the world, there are correspondence between people, you don't know who they are. It's like a huge jigsaw puzzle, and you have to start trying to piece it together.
While we're going around doing our own research and following up leads, it's not just us. There are more victims joining the association, and they're doing their own research. And I got contacted by this woman from Bolton.
I was born with, I had a lot of obstruction at birth. My stomach's on the wrong side. I have 7 spleens, spinal defects, and all in the arts. I've had a lot of operations to try and correct the stomach. It can't be put back together. I've had about 20 major operations.
She'd been to the National Archives in London, which for her is a 400-mile round trip. And she said, I've got these documents to show you. And they've been confidential for 30 years. So I agreed to meet up and we have a chat in her kitchen.
They've covered so many things up so many times. So many victims have already passed. So many parents, they're not gonna... They've buried the children and they've not even seen the evidence. They've not been able to explain. I just think it's appalling. They're never gonna see it.
So there are all these files relating to Primodos spread out on the kitchen table. But amongst them, there's this one letter by Professor William Inman after he's just met Dr. Isabel Gal, and he's talking to his colleagues about it, and it's really striking. Well, this is an extraordinary letter from the senior medical officer for the government to his colleagues in 1975, where he says he's just had an exhausting meeting, as he describes it, with Dr. Isabel Gal, and goes on to say she believes she should have had more funding for research, and that a large number of babies may have been born with abnormalities during the 8 years that have elapsed. He goes on to say that we're defenceless in the matter of the 8-year delay. This is hugely significant. It's a crystal clear admission from Inman that he got it wrong, that from the time that Isabel Gal came to him, flagging up her concerns, to the warning appearing on the packet that women may have given birth to babies with malformations unnecessarily. And you would think, therefore, that he would apologize to her. But it's quite the opposite.
Isabel Gal is an intelligent, dedicated, but rather sad little person, and finishes, "I dealt with her sympathetically to the best of my ability, but do not believe that we've heard the last of this matter."
The saddest thing for Isabel Gal, she was an absolutely brilliant scientist and doctor, and her career finished at that point. She never was allowed to have another senior position. One of the positions that she had been offered was withdrawn, and literally she never had the opportunity to complete the research she felt was so badly needed.
I think it's absolutely shocking, absolutely appalling. I saw the effect that it had on her personal life and her professional life. Why wouldn't you do something about it? Why would you obstruct, why would you as a medical authority obstruct the fact that harm was being done? Smothering that by also silencing the person that had found the connection.
So then we get another breakthrough, and it's relating to around the same time as the British families are taking their legal action in 1982. There is a German prosecutor who asks Shearing to hand over all of their documents relating to Primodos and hormone pregnancy tests to see whether there is a criminal action against the company. Now, for various reasons, that doesn't go forward. But then what he does when he's finished with the documents is he puts them in the National Archives in Berlin. So we put in a public interest access request, and the archives come back and say, yep, you can come and have a look. So now we're going to get to see the inner workings of the company. And what the papers reveal is the state of panic that has gripped the company by the legal action being taken by the British families over Primodos.
Some of the most interesting things that start to jump out at us are minutes of meetings that Shearing had with the British lawyer that they'd hired to defend them in the run-up to the court case in 1982.
And one of the first things he says to them is, have you done any tests? When did you test this drug before you put it on the market? And what becomes clear is that whilst they have done some tests in 1969, that's years after this has been given to thousands of pregnant women. So in the minutes of this meeting, there's this extraordinary revelation, because it says it was apparent that no toxicology had been carried out before introduction, either in Germany or in the UK.
Nothing shocks me anymore. I feel that we were duped. I think the doctors were certainly not given the information that they needed. And it's the fact that our regulators have allowed an untested drug to be given to a pregnant woman immediately after the thalidomide disaster. So I just find it unconscionable.
All the while we're digging through these documents, and then we find something that is perhaps the biggest revelation thus far in the investigation. It concerns details about the study Professor Inman had been conducting using the medical records of women that had been taking Primodos. You remember, this is the study he conducted in secret while the pill was still on the market, about which the women themselves knew nothing. And that study revealed that those who took hormone pregnancy tests had a relative 5-to-1 risk of giving birth to a child with a malformation. That's a high risk. That's above normal. That's massively above normal.
This figure we've never seen before. The families haven't seen it when we tell them about it, and neither has anyone involved in the story.
So Inman passes this information on to the manufacturer, and he says, I'm taking this unofficial route to contact you in order to let you know that you need to prepare yourself for potential medical legal challenges. Now, this is a British regulator. His job is to protect patients. It isn't to warn the manufacturer. His first instinct should be, there's a dangerous drug out there, we need to take it off the market, but that's not what his instinct is. His first instinct is to say to the manufacturer, look out.
Professor Inman meets a shearing representative and tells them that he's not happy about the way that his study that showed that there was a link between Primodos and birth defects has been received.
So he says to this scientist that he has destroyed all the evidence on which his investigation is based. And he has done that to prevent individual claims being based on his material. So he burns it. He destroys it. He gets rid of the evidence that could have been used by the families to sue the manufacturer. That's a cover-up.
I think that was reprehensible. I think he should, at that point, have made his findings clear, made his findings public. You should really come clean and tell the public what's going on.
The documents were an absolute game changer, particularly in relation to the documents we already had. They were unbelievable. And it actually gave me the opportunity then to find a really good solicitor who was willing to take our case on, which we'd really struggled with before.
I was actually astonished by the size of the task that Mary had taken on. She had what I can only describe as hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. So when we looked at the paperwork that we've seen, we realised there was two defendants here. Bayer as the manufacturers that have taken over from Sharing, and also the Secretary of State for Health in their role as regulators.
So then comes the next lead. We always knew that this drug had different brand names in different countries, and we learn about this case back in the late 70s over this drug called Gestest that seemed to use similar hormones to Primodos.
There was really very little information to go on at all because the details of the case had been sealed by the court. Part of the settlement agreement was that no details could be released, including even the name of the boy involved and his parents. But we did manage to find, eventually, one piece of documentation that remained, and that did have the boy's and his parents' name on it.
So Liz gets this phone number, and we ring the number of this woman in Florida.
A woman answers, and she says she's Ellen Hicks.
Are you the mother of this little boy? And she says, yeah, that's me.
We have a really long conversation, and she's quite emotional. But she ends the call by saying, yep, she'll help us, she'll talk to us, even though part of the settlement agreement was that no information about this case should ever be revealed.
There was a lot of chaos in the delivery room. And they wheeled me out and took me into a recovery room. Then the doctor came in and explained that our child had been born with horrific birth defects, and that they did not expect him to live. Robert and I laid him on the bed and unwrapped him and looked at him, and it was just mind-boggling. It was horrific. The most apparent thing was he didn't have any hands and feet. His limbs were deformed. They ended just below the knees on the legs and around the elbows on the arms. And then his face was disfigured. Other than that, he was beautiful. Little blonde-headed baby. He looked like a little angel. And we started questioning this drug that my doctor had been given to me. We were able to go through and subpoena documents from Squibb, and that's where we really started putting the case together, because we found research documents that they had in their files. We found internal memos that were very disparaging of the effects of this drug. It became very clear to us that this drug was harmful, that they knew it was harmful, that this drug was never tested on a pregnant woman.
So halfway through the case, lawyers representing the manufacturer throw the towel in. They say, we're not going to continue. We are going to pay out. We're not going to admit liability. The condition is that this legal team cannot take on other challenges from other plaintiffs. But crucially, there's a multi-million-dollar payout to Justin.
Then I got the call that he had taken his own life. The amount of hormones in this pill, Just Test, that I was given, the dosage was so massive that it should have caused a miscarriage. And in the writings, before he died, he kept saying, I should have been a miscarriage. I was never meant to be. And I don't know why I had to live like this. So he never got over it.
So we knew that this was a hormone pregnancy test and that it used very similar components to Primodos, but we weren't sure yet just how closely they were connected. But luckily for us, there was this guy who was a scientific researcher looking into the history of pregnancy tests. And Bayer, who would never give journalists access to their own internal archives, had actually allowed him in. And he'd got hold of these documents that were hugely significant.
This is sort of a crucial document, an official sharing list of products in Germany. So these are the trade names in Germany. These are the trade names in Ausland, so in foreign countries. And these are the trade names under license. Gubbins Simplex in Germany, Primodos, and under license, Guest Test. So it seems fairly unambiguous. Squibb essentially sold a modified version of duogenon of Primodos in the United States under the trade name of Guest Test.
You've got on one side of the Atlantic a family who have suffered from a drug that is essentially Primodos marketed under a different name, who've received a huge payout, whilst over here, the families have got nowhere with it and received nothing.
So we've had all these breakthroughs, but I also know about something else that's going on in Aberdeen. And it's a professor at the university who has been doing a study quietly into fish and the embryos of fish if he gives them the components of Primodos. I've called him over the years. I mean, it literally was a number of years. I called him saying, how are you getting on? And he was very, very guarded. In fact, he was even slightly annoyed that I had his phone number because he didn't really want to talk about his research. But then one day, he calls me up and says, okay, I'll talk to you about what I found.
We are interested in seeing what Primodos did to embryos. In my lab, we work on a range of embryo systems. One of the best ones we've got is zebrafish, because they develop rapidly, very, very quickly, so you can see what drugs do, and you can follow it live and see what's going on. They share 70% of their genome with humans, so they're very, very similar, and most of the disease-causing genes that we see in humans are also shared with zebrafish. High levels of high concentrations of the drug, you get various damage. You see damage to the brain, to the eyes, to the ears, to the fins, to the spinal cord, to the yolk sac, which is the equivalent of the placenta. If there's damage to the fin, you would suggest that you might see limb damage in a human. If you see damage in the heart, obviously you might see damage in the heart in a human. So the initial conclusions are that with high doses of Primodos, it's harmful to the fish. It's causing problems to the nervous system, to the vascular system, and it causes developmental anomaly.
So we've gathered all this information. We've got It's research in Aberdeen, we've got the case in America, we've got all these documents from the archives in Berlin, and we decided to put together a short documentary film. And we take it to the Houses of Parliament to show to MPs, along with some of the families who are seeing a lot of this information for the first time. Campaigners recently petitioned number 10, and this led to an expert working group being set up by the government to examine Primodos.
We will not go away. We will be coming back to the Minister, we will be coming back to the government, and we will make sure that our constituents, those families, get the truth, get the information, and get the acknowledgement and help that they deserve.
The MPs, after seeing this, are shocked. They're looking at this and thinking it's an utter scandal.
They hadn't realised the full extent of this, particularly the extent of the cover-up that had been going on.
And they're fired up now because there's this expectation that's growing for the expert working group that the government's put together that is going to come back with their findings.
You can't see the cursor.
Primodos was a drug given to women in the 60s and 70s. I first learned about it 6 years ago when I made contact with those campaigning for the truth.
My sister said, "You really got to watch this. There's this chap who looks incredibly similar to you."
Then the doctor came in and explained that our child had been born with horrific birth defects and that they did not expect him to live. And it was just mind-boggling.
It was incredibly painful to watch, really. Way before I was born, there were warning signs that this type of treatment ought not to be available.
We started questioning this drug that my doctor had been giving to me.
The families have now, by this stage, had a long history where the science seems not to be taken seriously by the regulator.
We have got this working group now looking at things. I mean, what do you hope happens?
We are looking to see, finally, whether the leopard will change its spots, frankly. Will the regulator finally stand up and do what it has failed to do in 50 years or so? Will it finally bring this to a conclusion and be more transparent in the way it's operating?
There was absolutely no reason to give a healthy woman a drug to test to see if she's pregnant.
I think the closer we get to publication, the more tense things become.
No, that's true. So that's, yeah.
Mari is clearly starting to have some concerns about the process of the expert working group. And she's feeling a lot of pressure because not only can she not talk to us, but she can't let the families know what's happening.
Because she's been gagged. She's actually had to sign something to say she can't tell me, she can't tell members about what's going in the meeting.
And it's only later when she actually gets a lawyer to have a look at it, because she wants to be able to let families and other people know what's been going on, that this lawyer tells her, no, actually, it's really strict. You could actually be sent to prison if you were to break this.
Some of the more damning evidence had not been touched at all. None of the German evidence had been touched, and I questioned that very, very quickly.
Very often, her voice was not heard. Although she tried very hard to be involved in the inquiry, she was subjected to all sorts of restrictions.
When I asked about my role within the group, which they'd said was as observer only, and my challenge was, if I'm observer only, how can I contribute if evidence is not being looked at?
All the reports were prepared by MHRA, which is very questionable because we were actually investigating failures by the regulator, and yet the regulators themselves were actually preparing all the work for the committee to look at. And these reports, I felt, in some ways, were quite biased. There was an unwillingness to look at the material in a very open way.
In November 2017, after sitting for 2 years, the expert working group is ready to publish its findings.
And the families are desperately waiting to hear whether this group has found a possible association between this drug and malformations, as set out in the terms of reference.
Breaking news for you now relating to a report released today on whether the use of a hormone pregnancy test in the 60s and 70s was responsible for serious birth defects.
The conclusions they've made is actually on a causal link, which I just cannot believe. The terms of reference are absolutely specific, that what they're looking for, or should be looking for, is a possible association.
Did they say whether they'd found a possible association?
No, they've not looked for it.
I have no confidence that the information they studied was 100% non-biased, so I'm afraid I don't have any confidence in the report at all. We feel let down, all of us, don't we? Yeah.
They won't even allow me to come into the meeting where they're going to be publishing this report. And I thought, you know, what the hell? I mean, I should be there, I should be listening. So, I mean, I was very, very angry and upset at the same time.
I was in the back of the room at the press conference, and the report authors were up on stage, and they make this big announcement, and it's not televised, this conference. They don't allow cameras in the room, but they say, we have found that there is not a causal association between the drug and malformations. And I'm thinking, well, that wasn't in your terms of reference. You were asked to look for the causal association. That's raising the bar. They haven't found the causal link between thalidomide and malformations in babies. They were asked to find if there was a possible association, and if so, was that properly acted on? So I'm thinking, you've had 2 years to look at this, and you haven't actually answered the question. So all I wanted to know from the chair of this group is there a possible link between Primodos and malformations?
We were open-minded at whether there was any association or not, and then the result of our expert group was not to find any causal association.
But I'm just interested, you're not willing to say whether there's a possible association or not?
Well, medicine is always uncertainty, and if any new evidence was to arise, we would certainly be happy to look at that. But from where we stand at the moment, based on our deliberations so far, we did not find a causal association.
But there were studies that were included that were non-peer-reviewed, that were produced by the manufacturer, Shearing, in preparation for litigation. Would they not be biased in any way?
That was all the relevant data that we have looked at as part of our remit. And of course, that's the problem we have. There are so many biases, and these older studies from the 1950s and 70s are not robust as we would, as scientists, look at them now.
So it's inconclusive?
No. We are confident that we have not been able to show a causal association.
You've not been able to show it because you're saying that everything's outdated and not robust.
Well, this is the most extensive review there has ever been of this topic. It's thousands and thousands of pages. All our findings will be available for public to view in due course. We're very open about all of that. Mrs. Lyon, who's the chair of the association, was present at every meeting and able to comment. So we're confident in our findings that we have not been able to show a causal association.
Just finally, are you confident?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further to that interview, we were provided with another statement.
It was that day for me that this didn't just become about my family. This became something much wider for me because it was appalling. It really was appalling.
Daddy, what's your drink? You always have a drink when you come in. Come on, spoon first.
On the night of the publication of the report, after that meeting, my dad was rushed into hospital with heart failure. And my dad was the only one there with his son who he cares for in a wheelchair by the bedside. And I just thought, I have to get justice for them. I can't let this go. And Dad said to me, how did it go? And I was thinking, oh, his blood pressure. Don't ask me that. I said, not good, Dad, but don't worry about it now. And he said, well, I suppose that's it then, is it? I said, no, it's just started.
If ever there was a report that reads as if the conclusion was written first and the data was made to fit, then this report ticks all the boxes.
Does he think it's appropriate that an expert working group changes the goalposts halfway through a process?
They were asked to look at a possible association, not a causal link, not a causal link, but a possible association.
I'm afraid to say I smell something like a very large rat in all of this.
The women and families affected by Primodos are still suffering from their loss. They are still grieving. They will not give up. They and all of us deserve no less than the truth.
I do not agree this is a whitewash. And let me just say one thing. At the request of the Association of Children Damaged by HPTs, Mr. Speaker, an invited expert, Nick Dobrik, who the House and the outside world will know well as a respected and well-known thalidomide campaigner, sat and attended all meetings of the expert working group. I do not think that the notion that Mr. Dobrik is some sort of government yes-man who would have allowed a whitewash to go on stands up to much scrutiny, if any at all.
This was a load of nonsense. I didn't recognise what they were saying. I had never supported the conclusion of that report. They used me blatantly to try and buttress their conclusion. It was a lie. In the end, the government spokesman, minister, apologised in the House of Commons to a question from Mike Pennon, and I thought it was totally shameful.
I was absolutely furious. I just knew I had to get this study reviewed. I had to do it. I was told that Carl Hennigan was someone that actually looked at the meta-analysis of studies. He works on evidence-based medicine. All I said to him was, Professor Hennigan, I need to speak to you. And he just said, you've got 5 minutes.
She basically said, could you go away and look at this expert working group's report? And in doing that, could you give us the honest answer? Are they correct? Or is there something as an independent person you could look at and tell us what you think is going on? Going through the whole report started to concern me that actually it was in a direction of travel that was not independent. There were things done, for instance, the quality assessment wasn't one I recognised. There were issues about how the results were reported.
I said, Carl, this report is very strange. I don't understand it. We must get hold of the data and analyse them ourselves and see what the real answer is.
How easy was it to get hold of the data?
Well, it wasn't easy because at the end of the day, we had to detail it through the House of Lords to request this data.
My Lords, the raw data which Professor Hennigan needs to complete his review has not been made available, and my view that this is tardy and uncooperative on the part of that body.
This is the point where I think the system is broken, to be honest. Why, in a position where we're supposed to be doing an independent report, can't we access the data that you have actually spent 2 years working on and presented to the government? Just does not make sense to me.
After a further delay, the data were sent to us.
We have statisticians, epidemiologists, all look at the data. When you actually then started to look at the more specific malformations like congenital heart disease, the effect size went up to about 89%. When you looked at neurological nervous system malformations, even higher. And then a specific syndrome, which is a combination of 4 or 5 effects called vector, even greater effect. So the more specific the malformation, the more the effect was greater, and all of them were significant.
The conclusion that I reach from Our independent systematic review is that there is clearly an association between the use of Primodos and the risk of fetal malformations.
Do you think there are people out there who, as babies in the womb, were malformed by this drug?
Yes, and I think the Committee on Safety Medicines knew that because they put it in the warning in 1975.
This is a really significant report because it's taken the same data that's been looked at by the expert working group and come to a completely different conclusion on the side of the campaigners. And this is all down to the fact that Lyon didn't give up. She went and got these independent experts to look at this. And as soon as she gets it, she takes it to Germany. She wants to go and meet the German MPs, the members of parliament there, and explain to them what's going on. She also takes the fight to Bayer, turning up at the annual general shareholders meeting in Bonn. Massive meeting.
When I finally went to give the presentation on how we felt that we'd been treated, they cut the microphone so that it would not allow me to continue to speak. I was so frustrated that I actually tried to go and speak to them directly.
And she marches right up to the front of the stage and confronts the managing director.
Mr. Baumann, will you finally give justice to the victims of Primodos and Duganol?
I just wanted to say in that forum that Bayer did have information, that they were aware of the damage, and they had done absolutely nothing to stop it.
Is there a possibility that you would like to meet at another time to discuss it?
They wouldn't engage, and eventually a security man came and literally just pushed us away, just put the hand towards our faces.
No pictures.
Okay, thank you.
And basically we were virtually ejected then from the conference room.
C'est fini.
Okay.
Despite many of these families having very little to cling on to, there is one thing that is going on that is giving the campaign some hope, and that is the scientific research that's being carried out in Scotland.
You'll remember that Professor Vargason has been up in Aberdeen looking at zebrafish and discovering that Primodos is causing malformations to embryos in the fish. And there's been pushback from the regulator into his research saying that the doses that he's using are too high. So he decides to go back and revisit the study.
So this is some of our new data using much lower doses of Primodos. And at first glance, you don't see much difference, right? So this is the control, this is the untreated, and this is the treated embryo. And there is subtle damage here. So this region here is the heart, and you can see here there's a raised area of the heart, which shouldn't be there. This is basically where fluid is accumulating in the forming heart. So we've got a brain malformation where there's part of the brain missing, which is missing from here. And you can also see changes in the part of the hindbrain, again, which is not apparent in the treated. Also the eye, you can see that the eye, where the lens is starting to form and invaginate, you can see that it's not as broad, it's not as wide as it should be. Yeah. So this is at a very low dose, which we think is physiologically relevant. And we are doing a lot more testing at the moment just to double check this and to get more numbers and to do higher and lower doses as well as other time points. But we're confident there's something going on here.
It's important to remember that the expert working group said that there were questions about the validity of outdated studies, and that's why some of the evidence wasn't as robust as they would like it to be. But now you have an up-to-date study using the latest techniques, finding that this drug does cause damage to the embryo. And it starts to raise more questions about the validity of that report, the report that the manufacturers, Bayer, are relying on in their defense, the report that was supposed to draw a line under all of this. There was something else that we discovered about that report. It was due to be published a month earlier than it actually was, and we got hold of the original draft document, and that turned out to be significantly different.
And this study is
all the lines represent the most definitive reports on hormone pregnancy tests, and these 8 highlighted all show an association. That was also taken out.
So I decided to put in a Freedom of Information request to try and get hold of the correspondence to find out who was behind these changes and why they'd been made. And it took 9 months and was even blocked at the Department of Health at minister level. But eventually, on appeal, the Information Commissioner's Office said that it was in the public interest to release the documents. What we were given was full of redacted names, but it was clear that people outside of this supposedly independent group were influencing the conclusions. In some emails, there are clear changes of text to make an association between the drug and malformations seem less likely. And it appeared that a line saying it's not possible to scientifically rule out any association was removed without all the members being told. There's also a warning from one expert that there was a blatant attempt to rewrite the remit of the group.
It's clear that there's been outside influence from the regulator on what was supposed to be an independent report, and they've changed the meaning of the conclusion.
We contacted the regulator and they confirmed that they and the chair of the group had endorsed the changes.
I think that Liz's Freedom of Information Act request is incredibly important. It shows that key changes were made to the report, and I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that those changes were endorsed by the entire expert working group. It looks like they were made at the last minute. It gave a totally different meaning to the report. And it's something that, as lawyers, we're looking at very, very carefully indeed, because that's a report that will be relied upon by the defendants.
There's a lot of uncertainty flying around Westminster. I'm getting emails from the Department of Health asking to see our original documentary. I've got MPs coming up to me saying, I need to speak to the Prime Minister about this. I know that she's having meetings, Theresa May's talking to some of the people within her own party who are raising concerns, and you get the feeling that something's going to happen. And then suddenly, there's a massive turning point.
When I looked at the report, I felt that it wasn't the slam-dunk answer that people had said it was. Now, I'm not a scientist. A lot of very eminent people had put that report together. But those 2 references that suggested that they'd come to a decision on balance and hadn't been able categorically to rule out a link between Primodos and congenital anomalies suggested to me that maybe actually this was something we should look into. That was on top of this wider issue of women campaigning for many years about this, raising their voices and seemingly not being heard. One almost felt it was sort of women being patted on the head and said, there, dear, don't worry, you know, you're imagining it, or it's not, you don't know, we know better than you do.
The fact that they have produced experiments that prove that these drugs were dangerous, and yet they suppress that evidence.
If you feel that there's been a problem, that you have suffered, but nobody will hear your voice. And it's, you know, great, well done to the campaigners.
But until she was actually...
Well done to Jason and Sky for actually having picked this up and run alongside the campaigners and helped to give this publicity. I explained to, within my number 10 team, that I think that we should look at this, that we should have a review on this. Ultimately, if the Prime Minister decides it should go ahead, then it will go ahead.
That's called the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Review, and that is chaired by Baroness Cumberledge.
Are you making signs for me, right? Do I need to speak up? Right, okay, thank you.
Now, Baroness Cumberledge immediately set about meeting all the members.
Please feel free to tell us what you want us to hear. or if you've got issues that you think we might miss, and about your family and the impact that Primodos has had on it, and she therefore.
It was all about the patients. It was all about the families. How could they interact? They listened, they were empathetic, they didn't judge. It was just incredible.
But our overriding determination is to ensure that voices are heard.
I think as I age, that I notice the tiredness, because I'm using two arms all the time to do anything like grip or twist or pick up or whatever. That I am actually becoming quite worn out.
I would like to see the government regulation in hospitals and fair sharing and admit, like, take responsibility to the damage that not only to the individual but all our members and all the children that are no longer with us.
You can't let these people suffer like this. And there's hundreds of people like it. Thousands more coming forward all the time. You know, you have to do something. You can't just ignore this. All we want is the truth.
So we're told we're going to get this report by email, and we decide we'll be with Mary. We'll go and receive this information together. And we get to her home in Wigan, and she is pretty down in the dumps because she feels that the soundings are that this may not be good. Why?
I just feel very depressed, quite honestly. Yeah, I do. Quite worried.
Yeah.
She is feeling a huge weight on her shoulders that if this doesn't go the way she wants it to, she's going to have to break the news to all the families.
No.
I felt quite sick when I came to open. In fact, I really struggled to open the first page. Oh my goodness. I've conducted many reviews, but I've never encountered anything like this, the intensity of suffering experienced by so many families. And the fact they've endured it for decades. Oh God, that sounds so promising. I see now there, you see, the system and its leaders need to acknowledge what has gone so badly wrong. That's more than I expected. I can't. I'm trying to be very calm. And I can't. It's a fact. It's been acknowledged. At last. So much for putting makeup on. It was a waste. Oh, good grief. I know I need to read the rest, but I'm quite stunned. I am absolutely stunned. Oh, good. There's a tissue as well. Oh, good grief. Hi, Nicky.
Hi, Marnie.
Right, I just wanted to let you know what has happened with the report from the IMMDS. The results are good.
Oh,
the results are very good. Are you shocked?
I am, yeah.
They've acknowledged that harm was caused. It was avoidable. It was unnecessary. And that the regulator did not act in the best interest of our families. And that is a huge result.
Yeah. No, I'll wait for my mum. Just saying that my dad's not here to
Oh, yes. I think that's the saddest thing, that your dad won't know.
No.
And I think
that's not will. No, it's, yeah, Yeah. Oh, not bad, actually. Yeah, not bad.
Eureka moment for me was the fact that they said from 1967 that Primodos should have been taken off the market, that there were regulatory failures. Had the government regulator at that time basically done the job that they were paid to do, that drug would no longer have been available. There would have been warnings given to all the mothers from 1967, and I'm one who was actually given that tablet. They would have been saved all this heartache.
It was amazing to read the report. It was amazing and horrifying at the same time, because all the stuff that Isabel went through and did, and never giving up, was there on paper now. It's not so much for her vindication, but for the victims of this, because that was always her driving force, to get recognition of what the victims have gone through and are still going through, some of them, but and what they went through without their knowledge and without being informed about what the consequences could have been. It was always her driving force. So she would be she would be delighted.
That could be our kind of lead-in to the piece.
Bid for Bayer,
because there'll be questions in Parliament as well. There's going to be a statement from the Minister.
When's your next live?
Next live is at 10 o'clock, 15 minutes.
Jason Farrell, is this a vindication for you and, much more importantly, for the victims of Primodos?
Yes, it is. We have been looking into this since 2011 for the victims. They've been looking at it since 1978, since the evidence first started to emerge. In fact, the evidence had already emerged amongst the medical community back in 1967, and this review today says that this drug should have come off the market back then. Cheers. How do you feel about the fact that it is the patients who've had to bring this to light?
I think it's a scandal. I think it's an appalling thing. I think it is showing really that the healthcare as a system doesn't work.
It's taken families decades to get to this. Do you agree with Baroness Cumberledge that this is a scandal?
Yes.
And I was gobsmacked, because this was the first time that anyone in government had actually accepted this is a scandal. And I said, my next question was, will you apologise?
I want to issue, on behalf of the NHS and the whole healthcare system, I want to issue a full apology to those who've suffered and their families, for the frustration, for the time that it's taken, that they've taken to get their voices heard.
I just thought of all the families. I thought of Nicky, and I thought of the mothers I'd met who lost their children. And I thought about, it's that word avoidable, isn't it? You know, all of this could have been avoided. And all that heartbreak and all the struggle that they've had in their lives. And finally, someone had admitted it wasn't their fault. They'd done nothing wrong. And then I thought of the fact that they'd had to make this happen, that through all the difficulties that they'd had, they were the ones, and only them, who got the authorities to open their eyes and see what had happened.
stop fighting now. This is the moment where we step up. We've got to keep that momentum going. So if people think we've been shut up, they'll be very sadly mistaken, I'm afraid.
I'm extremely protective of my family. There is absolutely no way I will give up on this until we have complete justice.
They have this one final hurdle, this huge pharmaceutical company to take on. That's their last big battle. Bayer would be stupid to underestimate Mary Lyon. You know, they might think they're massive, but she is not going to give up. My money's on her.
Back in July, the Cumberledge Review team said that Bayer had a moral and ethical duty to make amends to the victims of Primodos. Now, we've approached the company's chief executive for an interview, and he's been unavailable. So we've come here to their headquarters in Leverkusen in Germany to see if he'll speak to us. Mr. Baumann, from Sky News, are you going to compensate the victims of Primodos? Is Bayer going to pay them compensation?
The way that we've been treated by Bayer is basically with contempt. We have been forced to battle. We've been forced to wait. I'm extremely optimistic that we have a case to answer. This fight stops when we win, and not before.